Welcome to episode 278 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm reflecting back on 20 years of sharing teaching ideas and resources online. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. You are invited to join me on July 10th and 11th for a free online event I'm hosting. It's called the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Online Summit, and it features more than 25 teacher-led sessions sharing practical ideas for streamlining and simplifying your workload. The sessions are all just 15 to 20 minutes each, and there's no filler, fluff, or product sales. Each presenter is a member of my 40-hour program and a current classroom teacher, sharing their day-to-day habits that help them stop working endlessly on nights and weekends. You'll find organization tips, classroom tours, ideas for more efficient student engagement, strategies for creating better lessons in less time, ways to assess student learning more quickly, and lots of other practical info. It's free to sign up for the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Online Summit, and forever access to the recordings is available for a low purchase price. Join us July 10th and 11th for free by going to 40htw.com/summit. That's 40htw.com/summit. So if you're a longtime listener to this podcast, which I sort of assume you are because I'm not sure, if you're new to the podcast, you're probably not going to want to hear a deep dive into like how I became the person I became today. So you've probably been around for a while. And if so, then you know that I have been podcasting weekly with 2 breaks a year, one in the summer and one in the winter, since 2015. So it's been quite a while. And I recently switched from weekly to bi-weekly. So now it's every other Sunday. And I just started experimenting with that. And I love it so much. And I feel like it has worked so well that for the first time ever, I'm comfortable continuing to podcast during the summer months. So normally I take time off in the summer because I feel like you probably need a break from hearing about teaching stuff too. Like, listen to some other podcasts about like different topics, it's good for you too to also have a break. And also I really needed the break to feel like I had new ideas to share and fresh inspiration, like trying to come up with something interesting and new, inspiring, informative to say every single week for years is really hard. So having that break helped. But now that I'm podcasting bi-weekly, I'm still so energized heading into the summer. I'm ready to keep doing this. So we're going to keep going right through summer. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to be sharing some episodes that give you sneak peeks into the presentations for the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Online Summit. This is a free event that is happening completely online. It's July 10th and 11th, 2023. And these are short presentations, like 15 to 20 minutes. There's no fluff. There's no filler. It's just K-12 classroom teachers sharing their best time-saving tips. How do they manage lesson planning? How are they using tech tools to help them? How are they simplifying the way that they assess student work? And the ideas that they're sharing, like I've started going through the presentations already, like they're amazing, like just really, really great stuff. Just such a broad variety of ideas there. So I'm going to feature some of those on the podcast, and I will likely interview some of the presenters too so that they can share more ideas. So you'll be hearing a little bit of that. So when you do want to prepare for back to school, basically, or just sort of get inspired or collect ideas, that will be happening. I will also be interspersing those podcast episodes with this series, this 3-part series that you're listening to the first part of right now, which is a deep dive into my personal story, where I've been, where I'm at, where I'm going. So this is the first installment that you're hearing now. And the reason that I'm choosing the timing for this is because this summer marks 20 years since I started my website and began sharing teaching ideas online. So it was in July 2003 when I was about to begin my 3rd year of teaching. I had just been collaborating with other educators online via message board forums, and I took the plunge of learning how to code and built my first website to share what was working in my classroom. So in this 3-part podcast series over the summer, I'll share more about how I got from that to where things are today, along with some reflections about how I've changed as a person and as an educator over the years. I don't often talk about myself in terms of like my history and my story because frankly, like I don't want to be that vulnerable. I don't like putting my private life up for public scrutiny. And as I've been doing this for 20 years, that was pre-influencer culture. So I've never thought of myself as like an influencer. I'm not here to broadcast my life to the world. I'm here to share resources for teachers. Like it's very specific around that. And I have moved more into mindset. I have shared personal stories, but I don't know, as a Gen Xer, I guess I just have sort of a different relationship to transparency. In that when I started doing this, it was not normal to share every single aspect of your life online. So I just never really did that. And I'm kind of happy keeping that private. You know, like I don't talk about my marriage very much. And it's just because things that are important to me, I like to keep private. That's just my personality. So this 3-part series is a big digression from me. As you can hear, I'm just speaking off the cuff. This is not rehearsed in any way. I have a few bullet points of what I want to talk about, but so this will be very different tonally from what you're used to with the podcast. But I think it's important to do. And gosh, it's been 20 years now. Like let's lay it all out on the line, right? So I'm going to share how I've changed as a person and an educator over the years. That will be in the next part, and then in the 3rd part, I'm going to share what I have planned and where I see the field of education heading, and what I'm optimistic and hopeful about for all of us. Some of you listening have actually been on this journey with me for the entire 20 years that I've been sharing ideas online, which is just mind-blowing. I think you will really enjoy this look back on the previous 2 decades together. Others of you have come along more recently, and I hope that this podcast series gives you the backstory and the context to connect with what I do on a deeper level. I have a feeling as you listen to how I grew up and how I got to where I'm at now, a lot of things are going to click for you. Like, oh, that's why she's so passionate about this thing. Or, oh, that's why I hear little bits of this in her work. So you just get a little bit more context. I do want to give a content warning here. I will be talking about some personal topics that you are not used to hearing me discuss. I will not go into any detail, but I will briefly allude to sexual assault. And also I will be talking about my personal experiences with trauma created by racism and religion. So this is all well beyond the scope of what you would normally hear on Truth for Teachers. Please be aware of that and make sure that you are in the right headspace to listen. So I'm going to back up to the very beginning and talk a little bit about my childhood. When I was a little girl, I always wanted to be a teacher. I was one of those kids who played school all the time. I just loved teaching other children, both real and imaginary, and my stuffed animals. I also loved books, loved reading. My parents would talk about how I always had my nose in a book, like just constantly reading, as well as writing. I wrote my first book at age 5. And the one that I remember the most was when I was 7, and I had a little cousin who was about to start kindergarten, and she was scared. And so like she didn't know what to expect. So I helped her make a book about the experience, and I had a little Polaroid camera, and I took pictures of all the type of things she would do. You know, you'll have a snack, you'll go outside and play on the playground, you'll read a story. And I took pictures of her doing all of those things and then bound it together in like a little, like a stapled together book, that she could keep and reread to remind her of what the school day was going to be like to prepare her. So that's the kind of kid that I was, precocious, very precocious. I was introverted, and to this day, obviously I'm still introverted. I'm not sure that that's a personality or a temperament trait that can change, or at least for me, it didn't. But then as in now, I still like people. I enjoy people. It's just that I get recharged from being alone. Being with people eventually will drain me, whereas I can take basically almost unlimited alone time. And I was like that as a kid too. I had a very deep inner world of my own with lots of imaginary play. And, my parents will say that my favorite question was why. Everything was why. Why is the sky blue? Well, because God made it that way. Why? Well, that's how he wanted it. Like it would be this constant rabbit trail of questions that they couldn't really answer or didn't know how to answer for me. But I always wanted to know why. I was always questioning everything. And this made me not a good student. I think kids like that don't necessarily excel in traditional school. And in the 80s, when I grew up, I was in elementary school in the 80s, and I was at a private school. My parents put me in a Christian school, and it was very, sitting in rows and raising your hand and doing phonics drills and that sort of thing. And I was not a good student. I was very bored. Eventually, they had me skip second grade, so I went straight from first to third grade, which, nowadays they tend not to do that very much because, like, socially it can be a little difficult. But there was another girl in my class who became my best friend who also skipped second grade. So we were the two basically younger kids in the third grade class. So that was the solution back then, was basically, we'll just skip one grade and then keep teaching you the way that being taught is not really working for you. We're just going to keep doing it at a higher level. That was basically the approach. And that was pretty typical back in the 80s. So I like to point that out because I think it's so easy to criticize the way schools are now. And I don't think we always recognize how much the bar has been raised in terms of meeting student needs. There was no special ed program back then, like at my school. We didn't even have a gifted program. Like, there was no differentiation whatsoever. We weren't really trying to individualize education in those days. As I'm painting with a very broad brush, obviously, but I think that my schooling was very typical of the time. And so when we think about how difficult teaching is now, and how much is on, what kind of responsibilities are on the plate of schools, it's because we are attempting to do so much better for kids than we used to. And I think that is commendable. And so a lot of the problems that we have are because we're really trying to do better than what we used to have, which was this one size fits all, very rote learning. So I was bored. And also, like, even if I didn't know something, I thought I did. So I was probably a little obnoxious to my teachers. I also, like, all of my report card comments talk about how I never stopped talking. I was always talking over them, always off task. Like, I was probably not a joy to have in class. So, I mean, my grades were good. I got the work done somehow, but I just didn't really enjoy it. And so I was always having to make up my own games and my own, like, processes to make learning more interesting. Like, we would be copying Bible verses in cursive to practice our cursive writing. And I would pretend that I was, on a TV show that was teaching kids how to write in cursive. And so I would pretend I was being videoed. And so I would, like, make my cursive exactly right and, like, be thinking in my head of the dialogue that I would say to explain what I was doing. Like, I would have to make the task more challenging and more interesting and more engaging. So I think it's interesting that, like, I wanted to be a teacher despite not really liking school. I think I always kind of had it in my head that there was something enticing there. There was something about teaching and learning that lit a spark in me. And maybe I just wanted to do it differently. Like, maybe I just wanted to be the person in the front of the room instead of the person, like, in the student seat. That actually makes a lot of sense now that I'm thinking that through. So I had a good childhood. My parents, loved me very deeply. I had a pretty non-traumatic childhood as far as childhoods go. Just like normal stuff, nothing out of the ordinary in terms of challenges. My dad was in the Army, so we moved every 2 to 3 years. And that was not traumatic for me at all. Like, that was my normal life. I didn't know anything different. And my parents were both very positive about it. So, even though I knew it was difficult, particularly on my mom, to have to keep uprooting and making new friends every time, we went someplace new, it was a lot on her. But, they had a positive attitude about it. And I was always exposed to a lot of other military families. So that was just what we did. And what I think is special about that upbringing is that it just exposed me to lots of different types of people from a very young age, lots of different ways of being. When I was in middle school, we lived in Norway. So I, in the very formative years, when you're first starting to really want your independence, I was able to have a lot of independence because it was so safe there. I could take the train into Oslo with my friends and spend the whole day just downtown, doing whatever kids do, going to McDonald's, whatever, and take the train back. And my parents didn't have to worry about me. I got to have a lot of really cool experiences because of that. So, because I lived in the Southeast, the Northeast, I'm talking about the US now, Arizona, Washington State, Norway, Indiana. Like I've lived in like so many different places that are so different culturally. It really, I think it kind of ingrains something in me that there's no one right way to be, that there's lots of different ways to live. Lots of different personality types. Like my parents grew up in a small town in Virginia together. And my dad joined the army actually to avoid the draft, for the Vietnam War. And he and my mom got married very young because that was the only way they could stay together when he was in the army. And so they weren't exposed to very much until then. Like they had always been in this one small town their whole life. And it was a very different experience for them than it was for me, constantly moving and constantly like seeing different people. Like I think that made me a more open-minded person, I guess. More flexible in my thinking. Like I feel like being the child of someone in the military just had lots and lots of benefits for me. I actually can't even think of any drawbacks. It was definitely a net positive for me. And I think the other thing that it did was it taught me what it was like to be the new kid and not know anyone. And to this day, when I'm with a group of people and there's someone who I could tell feels left out or doesn't really know anyone, I like work overtime to make sure that they feel included, to explain the inside jokes to them, to introduce them to people, to sort of bring them into the fold. Like it deeply bothers me to see people feeling left out. Like that like hurts me to the core. And not because I have any experience where I really felt left out, but I just was constantly surrounded by that. Like, I remember in middle school, we had, I went to an American international school and we had a new girl come in named Naoko who was from Japan. And she didn't speak a word of English. And like, it's very hard to be friends with someone when you don't speak each other's language at all. But like, I always invited her to everything. When we had our little sleepovers, Naoko always came. And, I don't think she understood even like a third of what we were saying, but I wanted her to be part of the group. That was just really, really important to me, to set that tone among my friends that like, we include everyone. We don't leave anyone out. Imagine if you were the only person who didn't speak the language. And we knew what that was like because we were in Norway. Most Norwegians speak English, but like I'm constantly seeing signs and directions and things that are in a different language that I can't understand. I know what that feels like. And I want people to be included. So I feel like that was like a core value that was shaped in me from childhood, not intentionally taught to me, but that was just my reaction to it was, I think some people in that situation may kind of get more closed, more clique-like, to go like more into a little bubble, which that's another coping strategy. For me, it was to be as inclusive of as many different people as possible, to not shut anyone out, to be open to all kinds of different situations. So that was my childhood. My teenage years were much, much rougher. If you listen to episode 163, it talks about how I was a disengaged student who almost dropped out of high school. I was really, really struggling. I have a very different perception of what my teenage years were like than my childhood. I think it's because I was, around 13, 14 is when you really start exploring who you are. And, your peer groups are more important to you than your family. And I felt very torn between my Southern Baptist upbringing and my Southern Baptist church and who they were telling me to be, and the social peer pressure, which was basically the opposite of that. And I didn't know who I was at all. And I didn't know how to figure out who I was. And I feel like young people often get the advice to like, just be yourself. If you don't know what to do or you're in a group of people that you don't know, just be yourself. And I found a diary entry from when I was 14 in which I was reflecting on this advice and how confusing it was. And I wrote like, I'm 14. How am I supposed to know who I am? How am I supposed to know what I like? Like, I haven't even seen enough to know what I like and don't like. I haven't tried enough things yet to know what's me and what's not. So I'm basically just emulating other people. Like, what's popular in my youth group? What's popular in my high school? What are the things, that my family members are passionate about and therefore they've trained me to like to do? Like, I don't actually know who I am or what I like. And, when you don't know who you are and you're torn on your own personal values, you're open to a lot of things that can be really damaging. So I was in this very weird place in high school as like, I'm a people pleaser, but I'm also rebellious. And I wanted people to like me, but I'm also questioning everything. And I'm constantly challenging the status quo. Like, that was very much a theme of my teenage years. And I really gave my parents a run for their money. Like, those were not easy years for any of us. So here's one really interesting piece of it. We were living at this time, my dad was stationed at Fort Meade, which is in Maryland, and we were living in Prince George's County. Prince George's County is the wealthiest majority Black county in the country. So this doesn't mean that everyone around me was rich. What it means is that I was a racial minority because the majority of the county was Black. And because when I say wealthiest, that also implies that you have positions of authority, right? So people of color, particularly Black people, particularly African Americans, have power and influence over the culture, over the government, over the way that things are done, in a way that I think most young white people, especially in the 90s, were not able to experience. I may have a Black boss. We have a Black mayor. My doctor is Black. I'm seeing Black excellence. I'm seeing Black people thriving and, doing all the same things that white families are doing. And I'm experiencing the richness of particularly African American culture on a regular basis. So, in one of the first schools I taught in, after we said the pledge to the American flag, we would sing the Black national anthem. I didn't know that that wasn't a normal thing in American schools, so that's not something that typically happens. But it was normal for me. And understanding how to, what it's like to be a racial minority really shaped who I was as a person. I didn't experience any discrimination towards me. I was never treated poorly. But I do know what it is like to not have people who look like you and have your culture centered. I know what it's like to be on the margins and what it's like to have to fit yourself into a dominant culture that is different from yours. And that's something that a lot of white Americans don't get to experience. And it's something that I think is good for us to know, to feel what that's like, to walk into a room and be the only person of your race in that room. A lot of white people have never had that experience in America. And it will change the way that you see race. And because I experienced that as a young person, it became even more formative for me. And then in my Southern Baptist upbringing, I was getting the colorblind theology, right? Like, we're all the same in God's eyes, and, we don't see color. And then I tried to date a Black guy, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, they do all see color. Oh, they all see color. Oh. So we believe that white and Black people are equal, but you're not supposed to fall in love with them or date them. Oh, okay, I see. And that's when everything that I had been taught really started to fall apart, because I'm like, wait a second. I thought we were all the same in God's eyes, but you have a sense of superiority over this other group of people. So when I confront this, I'm told, oh, we're not racist. We don't think we're better than Black people, but some white people think that way. And if you are in an interracial relationship, it will make your life harder. Now, this is very confusing for me, because not only does it contradict what I'm seeing around me in terms of Black people thriving and having home ownership and all of these things that, that white families are doing, but also, I've not been taught anything about systemic racism or structural or institutional discrimination. And so I'm hearing, if you marry a Black person, your life will be harder. And I can't figure out why that would be true unless Black people actually didn't have equal rights, unless Black people actually were discriminated against on such a large scale that it would be a detriment to my life to partner up with a Black person. No one is able to properly explain to me what they mean by my life is going to be harder. So what I'm just thinking is, so I'm not supposed to love who I love because some bigot out there might not agree with it. Some hypothetical stranger, some random white person that I don't even know actually exists, might not like the fact that I'm in an interracial relationship, and therefore I should change who I love because of it. That was not going to fly with 15-year-old me. Now, my parents had pulled me out of the local public school at this point. They had tried it there, and it wasn't good for me. I just had too much freedom. There was no one paying attention. It was like 2,000 people there, 2,000 kids. And so I was just like skipping class and making out with boys in the hallway and just like a little bit of a hot mess, basically. Typical teenage stuff, but just it wasn't good, and I was failing. I was getting D's and F's because I just didn't care about school. I was just not engaged. And there was no one there to make me be engaged because it was a big school. So they pulled me out, put me back into a Christian school as I had been to in some previous places that we had lived. This was a much smaller school. The class sizes, I think there was like 15 people in my graduating class. So there was absolutely no way I was getting away with anything there. What was interesting was the curriculum was still, it was a whitewashed curriculum. Let's put it that way. However, during Black History Month, one of my teachers had us read A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, who was a Black playwright. And it really shook my sheltered worldview. I don't recall anyone else in my class really being deeply affected by it, but it really moved me. And we went to go see it in DC, a professional production at the National Theater. And it shook me. It really shook me. And I started going to the library because, as you know, I was a really avid reader and started reading like James Baldwin, poetry by Nikki Giovanni, and just the works of revolutionaries, basically, and started getting into some of those types of topics. Now, at the same time, without going into too much detail, let's just say when I was 14, something happened. And I received a message that I had asked for it, and it was my fault. And I'll just let you read through the lines on that one. And I was receiving very confusing and conflicting messages about sex and gender roles and all those kinds of things between the church and everything else, basically. And it made me angry that I was blamed for something that I felt powerless to stop. I did go to the police and file a report, and that made my life a living nightmare for a long time afterward because of how that case was handled. So that's when I first learned about the patriarchy. And suddenly a lot of things started to make sense about like what was not right in my world. I was starting to understand racism and white supremacy, and now I'm understanding the patriarchy. I'm like, oh, okay. So this is a disconnect. And because it's the 90s, like zines and magazines were like, that was the big thing. And Sassy magazine was everything to me. I wasn't allowed to subscribe to it because it was too worldly. I was only allowed to subscribe to Christian magazines, but they had a copy at my local library. All these books I'm getting, by the way, are at the local library. So more power to libraries. So I would always go in every single month and read the latest Sassy magazine, like every single word. And it was the first exposure I had had to the 90s version of body positivity, sex positivity, women's empowerment, what would now be called LGBTQ affirming ideology. I just hadn't seen it before. And it suddenly helped. It helped me make sense of the world. Suddenly things were making sense. Why I was receiving these different messages, why I felt like I couldn't be what I was supposed to be or what was expected of me. Just a lot of stuff really started to click. So my point in sharing all of this is to highlight that I was always a questioner, just as I am now. And I didn't feel like I was getting good answers from anywhere about why the world worked the way that it did. And it was deeply important to me to understand how the world works the same way it is now. I've always been a person who needs to know why systems were set up the way they were. Why is there so much inequity? I think all kids have an innate sense of justice, like they want things to be fair, but righting wrongs and understanding structural systems was really important to me, even though I could never have articulated it that way until very recently. That's basically what I was doing. I was doing like a teenage 90s version of that. So that's the background about who I was when I was younger. As I shared, I always wanted to be a teacher. So that was never in question. And I will say that in retrospect, I wonder if part of it was because I wasn't sure what else was really open to women. The women in my family either did not work outside the home or did not, they did not have careers, right? It may be like a little part-time job to bring in extra money. Sorry, I shouldn't say little. That's patronizing. They had a part-time job to bring in extra money. But they were not the breadwinners. They were not career driven. I didn't see it. And the women I knew who had careers were teachers. Like that's who I'd been exposed to. So, and I think that being a teacher fits really well with my gifting, and my talents. So I'm happy with that. I don't feel like I was limited in any way or that I should have been doing something different. But looking back now, I do think it was interesting because, as they say, if you see it, you can be it. And I wasn't seeing a whole lot. So the fact that I sort of pigeonholed myself into wanting to be a teacher from a young age, I just find really interesting. So I was set on that path. As I shared as a teenager, my grades were horrible. I was so disinterested in school. I don't know how I thought I was getting into college. That's what happens when your prefrontal brain cortex is not fully developed. Like you just don't make the connection between the fact that if you're always skipping classes and you have like a 2.0 GPA, you're probably not going to get to go to school. But as I shared, my parents had pulled me out and put me in that private school where I had to go to class. I couldn't get away with skipping anymore. And so my cumulative GPA was much higher. And I was able to get into a college. And I chose a women's college that was in Frederick, Maryland. It's called Hood College, named after Margaret Hood. Today it's co-ed, but I chose it because it was a women's college. And I was very much into feminist theory at that time. And, dismantling the patriarchy was a big thing for me. And I wanted to be in a place where I felt like I could focus on learning. And I wanted to be more in solidarity with other women and develop friendships. Like that was a big priority for me. So so I went to Hood College and it was a wonderful experience. I am still friends with a lot of the girls that I was friends with then. I have wonderful, wonderful memories. I grew up so much there. Like I was so messy as a teenager. My room was disgusting. And then when I went away to college, my parents were like, why is your room so organized and clean? I'm like, I don't know. I think it's just something about the autonomy of feeling like this is finally my own personal space. I don't have anyone telling me what to do anymore. And so I guess I just sort of stepped up. But I was so desperate for independence at that point. Like I wanted to just be away from my parents, from the church, from everything, and just like make my own way. And that's what I feel like I did there. I, made some good choices, made some bad choices, but overall it was really good. And my education was fantastic there. I took an art class and it was an art history class, and the professor said, you're really good at this. Have you considered double majoring? I'm like, I had not. But now that you mention it, maybe I will. Like you see this spark in me, this bit of talent, maybe I will pursue it. And I think that's important to mention, like here, as I'm talking to you as an educator, like you never know when that one little offhanded comment that you make to a student in which you observe one of their skills could shape their whole life path. I ended up double majoring. I majored in early childhood education and art because of that one comment. That professor said I had a knack for analyzing art. And so I should pursue that. And I did. It was wonderful. And we would take trips into DC to the Smithsonian and, study the art there. It was lovely. And my education courses were fantastic. There was a early childhood learning lab on site. So it's basically like a teaching school. And the teachers who worked there were just incredible, just shaped so much of my personal philosophy, my interaction with children. And the reason that I had picked early childhood was because even in the 90s, I could tell that standardized testing was about to ruin education. Like the first set of standardized tests were coming out then. And at the time, they were actually they started off in Maryland. They started off as group work, which is really interesting. Like the kids would work collaboratively together to design something. It was really awesome. It was sort of like the precursor to project-based learning. But then they realized, well, we can't be accountable for individual children's learning. So we have to move to basically the mess that we have today, right? So that was just sort of starting. And I could tell, I don't want to do worksheets with kids all day. I don't want to test kids. This is just not going to be fun. I want to have fun. I want to be creative. And I read in one of my child development books that there's a certain amount of a child's personality is solidified by age 5. And I thought, if I can get to these kids before age 5, I can help shape them into the type of human beings who are curious and open-minded and enthusiastic about learning and empathetic and kind to other people. Like, I saw it as a way to shape the future, like to shape the future generation, get them young, influence them while they're young, expose them to really awesome stuff while they're young. And, and hopefully they would carry that with them. So that's why I was majoring in early childhood education. And I really loved my experience at college doing that. So once I graduated, I moved back to Prince George's County, and I got my first teaching job. The Head Start program there. So Head Start is a federally funded program for low-income families with preschoolers ages. There's actually like a birth to 2 program, I believe, as well, but I was working with the 3 and 4-year-olds. And in Prince George's County, at least at that time, they had some sort of partnership with the local public school system. So I was actually employed by the public school system and, most importantly, making a public school teacher salary and getting public school teacher benefits. Because Head Start teachers typically make far less, like most early childhood educators, unfortunately. So I was actually making good income. I was working in a public school, but I was getting to teach Head Start. And Head Start is a fantastic program. I had a wonderful experience with that too. We had a class size cap of 18. I always had an assistant. We had a family services worker who would visit with the families and go with me to do home visits. We had, a nurse come in and teach the kids like how to do basic hygiene. We brushed our teeth after our meals. Like, it was so holistic. It was so holistic. And there were so many other people playing a role besides me. It wasn't just all on me to help these kids overcome whatever obstacles they were facing. I could actually focus on my expertise and my passion, which was, the academics basically was actually teaching and learning. Those were the things that I was excited about, was teaching and learning, designing curriculum, making games for them, that sort of thing. And then I had other people who could help with all of the other stuff because, some of them still need help when they go to the bathroom. Some of them, maybe their parents needed support with something. And the fact that I didn't have to do it all because this was such a holistic program, like we were actually in partnership and we would have meetings to talk about, like, how do we support this particular family? What does this child need? What does this child need? And we were a team. Like, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. And I appreciate it so much more now in retrospect. Once I moved away from Head Start and I realized what it was like to be isolated on your own in a classroom, fully responsible for every single issue that all of the kids are bringing and all of the things they're facing at home and in the community and in the broader society, like, it's kind of all on your shoulders. I felt like Head Start helped lift me out of that. And it was a great way to begin my teaching career because I had that kind of support. So I did that for 3 years. And then I got a little restless. I was really passionate about different teaching strategies and just different ways of teaching and learning that I wanted to experiment with and that 4-year-olds just couldn't do. I wanted to do group work. I wanted to have kids be able to read something and then do it. And so I realized it was just time for me to move a little bit up, basically, in grade levels. So because I was early childhood certified, I was certified up through 3rd grade. That was the highest grade that I was certified to teach. So that's what I did. I got a job teaching 3rd grade, and I loved it. Like, to this day, that is still one of my favorite grades because they're still young enough to be enthusiastic and excited about learning, but they're mature enough to, like, you can reason with them. Some of them you can make jokes with and they get your sense of humor, they can work independently. I don't know. It's just a really neat age. That is my favorite age. So I ended up staying in the classroom for 11 years. And I'll get to what happened afterwards in a little bit. But I want to talk about how I got started sharing teaching ideas. So I was teaching 3rd grade in Prince George's County, Maryland. And I was looking online for teaching ideas. So this was a new thing at this point. So this was like the early 2000s, and there just wasn't a lot. There was not a lot on there. And so mostly what we had was message board forums. So people would go in and be like, my kids are driving me crazy in the hallway. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, how do I get them to like line up and walk down the hallway without disrupting all the other classes? Or, my kids are constantly getting up and getting a drink in the middle of my lesson. What do I do? So those kind of practical things really fascinated me, because the pedagogical stuff, the curriculum stuff, I feel like I was trained for that well in college. But these kinds of classroom management things, we were all just making it up on our own. We didn't know what we were doing. So I was very active in the message board forums. And then I realized when I asked questions, I got great responses, but then I was also able to answer questions. And as a third year teacher, that was very exciting for me to feel like, wow, like I guess I was in my fourth year at that point, because I taught 3 years in Head Start. So this was my first year in third grade. I was trying to learn all these different strategies. And I realized like, I actually have good ideas, even though I'm new to this grade level, even though I'm, not nearly as experienced as most of these teachers. Like, I have some important stuff to share. And I would share things in the message board forums, and people were like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. That's perfect. Why didn't I think of that? Same stuff people say today, right? Like, why didn't I think of that? I feel like I should have been able to come up with that on my own. But sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? And I feel like that's one of my giftings, is to be able to see the forest and the trees. So I ended up like copy pasting the same answers over and over again. And it was always helpful to people. People always said thank you. And I was like, you know what, there's got to be a faster way. Like, what if I posted this someplace on the internet, and then I could just give people the link to that? So blogs had really not been invented at this point. Like, there was no like easy way to do it. You had to basically learn HTML coding to some extent and put it on a website. And that's what I did. That was like my hobby, was building out this website of classroom management ideas. And then my school got a digital camera, and it was the first time that any of us had ever really seen one. They were very expensive, and they just come out, and it was something for all of us to share basically. And I was like, oh, so I can take pictures on this camera of my classroom, and then I can upload them to my website, and people can see like how I've arranged my room and how do I organize things. Like, that's so cool. So I did that. And I was literally one of the first people on the internet to do that. Laura Candler was also back during that time. She was really big. Vanessa Levin was another. Cherry Carl was another. Like, there was a little cadre of us who were among the first to upload their teaching activities and their classroom pictures to the internet on our website. There was no social media, there was no blogging, and there was no monetization. That's the other thing. I think the first way I ever made money off of that site was through Amazon affiliate links, but even that was like 3 to 4 years into it. In the very beginning, none of us, like, it wasn't a thought. It was just purely sharing ideas. Everything just grew really organically from there. And I'm really proud of that. I don't talk about it a lot, but I do see myself as a pioneer of what you see online today. We never would have imagined back then that Instagram and Pinterest and, a video camera in a smartphone and online courses, teachers pay teachers. We could never have foreseen any of that. All of that was all to come. And it really sort of stemmed out of this initial cadre of teachers who were sharing ideas on message boards, and then some of us eventually put it onto our website, and it grew from there. So I think of that as like a really important part of my legacy, that I inspired other people to do the same. Like, there are so many teachers who saw what I was doing and was like, oh my gosh, I can do that. And I'm like, yeah, you totally can, and you should, and I will help you. And they created their own sites and, have just done amazing things with it. So it was a really, really cool time to be on the internet, because it was just very pure. So this is ending up being much longer than I thought it was going to be. Maybe I'm sharing more than I had intended to, but, as a recap up to this point in terms of teaching and the website, even though I didn't start my website until 20 years ago, I actually have been in the education profession for 25 years. because prior to creating the site, I had already been teaching. And also throughout college, I worked at daycare centers as my summer job. And, I was just one of those people who always wanted to teach. And, I taught Vacation Bible School at the church, like any opportunity to teach. I was always the teacher. And the idea of being a teacher one day is a lot of what got me through those very rough high school years. I was struggling to find anything meaningful in school, but I knew that I needed to graduate with good enough grades to get into college, so that I could have a degree and have my own classroom one day. Like that was in the back of my mind. And, I was able to do at my private Christian high school. It was a K-12 school. And somehow, I don't know how I convinced them to let me do this, but I convinced somebody to let me get out of some class to go help out down in the kindergarten and first grade classrooms and be like a TA down there. And that was the highlight. That was just the absolute highlight for me, was getting to be with those kids, getting to watch those teachers. And I remember one of those teachers, her name was Miss Cernovsky. She was fabulous. She taught me how to hang a bulletin board, because there's a trick to it, right? Like that paper is like, the huge butcher paper is like very unwieldy. It's hard to manage. And she showed me how you can use like the scissors, like open up the scissors and drag it along the edge of the bulletin board to cut it so that it's nice and even, like little things like that. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I feel like I can actually be a real teacher. And those little like hidden tricks of the trade are what have always made me come alive. Like I love that. That's my favorite thing to share with people, is again, the stuff that like you think you could have come up with it on your own, but you didn't. And it just, I don't know. That's just the stuff that I love. So, I ended up teaching full time for 11 years, in the Washington, D.C. area in Prince George's County. And then I moved down to Florida, which was in my, I think, 6th year of teaching. And I taught in Miami-Dade. And then I taught in Broward, which is the county where Fort Lauderdale is, basically. So all South Florida. And I taught 2nd and 3rd grade as well. I'm going to actually talk about that time period in my teaching in the next episode with my reflections, because it ties so tightly to what I'm doing now. That was the time period in which I got my national board certification, and I started to really recognize the aspects of my work that I loved and that I wanted to do more of. So I will share more about that in the next episode. I feel like this has already gone on long enough, but I liked what I did, and I kept building out the website. I wrote my first book. I wrote the classroom management book, and then I started writing Awakened when I was still in the classroom there. And a lot of the stories from that time you can hear on the podcast or in my other books and things like that. So I had been teaching for 11 years. I was teaching 3rd grade in Fort Lauderdale, and I met my now husband. So he is a native New Yorker, and he is also a musician, and he owns an event planning company. So like, if you need musicians for a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a corporate event or something like that, he runs that whole thing, right? So it's the kind of business that you can do very well at in New York, but not necessarily everywhere. And a lot of it is networking and connections. And like, he was so well established where he was. So when we were about to get married, we're trying to figure out like, what are we going to do here? I'm like, I guess it makes the most sense for me to move to New York. I had been in Florida for a long time, and I was kind of ready to move on at that point. I was ready to do something different. Now, unfortunately, we got engaged in 2008. And if you could think about what was going on in the world in 2008, that was the Great Recession. So New York was laying off teachers at that point. I attempted to apply for a number of teaching jobs in the city and couldn't get hired. So it's just amazing how much things change, right? The pendulum swing between like abundance of jobs, scarcity of jobs. So yeah, I could not get hired as a teacher. And, we had been dating long distance for 2 years, just sort of flying back and forth between Florida and New York. And so after we got married, I actually continued teaching in Florida while I was trying to figure out like, what am I going to do for work? And I ended up finding 2 part-time jobs in New York. So one of them was working for Brain Pop. If you're familiar with Brain Pop at all, they make those animated educational videos for children. I was helping to create the scripts, the lesson plans, and the activities for Brain Pop Junior, which is for the younger kids. So Brain Pop is based in Manhattan, and this was a part-time job. So I was like, okay, this is great. And then I took another part-time job doing instructional coaching. So let me talk first just briefly about Brain Pop. They are so awesome. Like they're just an amazing company. I just enjoyed that experience so much. And it was the first time I had ever really worked in an office. You know, this idea that like there's unlimited Post-its. I can take my lunch break whenever I want to. Like it was so different from anything that I was used to. And it was just a really cool experience and just a really great company. So, it was a great transition for me, basically, to working in New York. And then, as I said, the other job was with a private company that I did not have as great of an experience with. So I will not mention their name, but it was a private consulting firm that got funding through the city schools to bring in consultants and do instructional coaching. So at that point, I had already published my first book. And I had started to do a little bit of professional development around that to do some teacher trainings. So the idea of getting to do instructional coaching really felt like a dream job at that point. It was scary because I didn't know if I could do it. Not only was I getting married and relocating 1,000 miles away, but I was also essentially changing my career trajectory. So it was really a lot, but, there were good and bad things. I really enjoyed working with teachers. I really enjoy doing model lessons, like going into the classroom and teaching their kids, like showing them this is how this strategy can work with your actual students. Like, I'm not going to just tell you this is what you should be doing. It's like, here's some strategies you can try. What do you think would work best with your kids? I'll do it first. I'll go in there and I'll troubleshoot and I'll see how they respond to it. And then you watch me and you give me feedback and then you try it and then I'll give you feedback. Like that was like my absolute favorite thing. And I got to work with teachers all over the 5 boroughs of New York. So I saw some things. I mean, I worked in yeshivas, which are the Jewish schools. I worked in Catholic schools. I worked in public schools. I was in the Bronx. I was in Brooklyn. I was in Staten Island. It was all over the place. So I got to see a lot of different sort of school norms, cultural norms, demographics. I mean, it was just very, I don't even have words for it. Clearly it was, it helped shape who I am today in the same way that moving all over the place because my dad was in the Army as a child shaped who I am today. Like, again, just being exposed to so many different ways of doing things and realizing there's not just one right way. And some things are more effective in this area and some are more effective in this area. And this might work over here, but not over there. Like, getting to see that was just really, really valuable for me. So I liked that part of it. What I did not like was coming in as an outsider and trying to create change in like 3 days. That just didn't really work for me. And I was also frustrated because I was doing, it depended on what the contract was for. Sometimes it was literacy coaching, sometimes it was math coaching, and sometimes it was instructional technology coaching. But depending on the school and where the money came from, there were times when the principal did not really value me, was not really happy to have me there, but just like kind of needed to spend the money. And so I would come in to work with the teachers and they wouldn't have a sub to cover their classes. So I couldn't work with them. And they're like, well, just go into the classroom. I'm like, okay, but how am I supposed to talk with a teacher when they've got 30 kids in the room? Like, they're trying to teach. They can't focus on analyzing their teaching with me when the students are in the room. Like, I just got frustrated feeling like, it was a waste of money. I mean, consulting is expensive. And, it was just, I don't know, it kind of annoyed me that the consulting firm was taking so much of the money and I was doing all of the work and we weren't really making any headway because the administrators were not prioritizing it. And it was a completely different experience when the administrators did, because I also had administrators who would meet with me and create a plan with me and, make sure that time was set aside for the teachers to meet with me. And they got their money's worth. And that made me feel good. I felt like I actually made an impact. Other schools, I feel like it was just a waste of time and money. Like, I don't even know what I'm here for, and I remember like one school, no one could meet with me. And I ended up like alone in this room with this technology. And they're like, can you update the software and the computers? Okay. That is just not what I was put on this planet to do. I'm really glad that there are people who do that job. That is not my area of expertise. That is not my passion. Like, I'm here to talk about how to integrate technology into instruction, like the pedagogy. I'm not here to update computer software. And that's what I was doing. And then like, I open up the closet and there's 10 brand new laptops still in the box that are 6 years old and are completely out of date and no one even got to use them. And the teachers had no laptops, Like, it was just stuff like that. You could hear the frustration in my voice. It's like, I have a limited amount of time and energy on this planet. I know what my gifts are, and they're just not being utilized here. Like, I am doing so much better with the stuff that I'm doing online, with writing my books, with the professional development, with courses. The blog at that point was really well built out. I had a lot of stuff going on there, like just a lot of articles and resources. I was creating curriculum materials and selling them on Teachers Pay Teachers. Like, I just felt like all of those things, I was able to make a much bigger impact, and it was just a better use of my time. So eventually I pulled back from that sort of work. And I do still do some instructional coaching, but it's with people who specifically request me and my services. And so I know that's going to make an impact. That's very different from like, I have extra title funds, send somebody in here to help with math, So I love it when it's done well, which is, I think, how most people feel about teaching too, right? Like, teaching can be great if you have the support and resources to set you up for success. Otherwise, it's really frustrating. So, so a lot of what I ended up doing then just moved more and more online. And when I started the 40-hour teacher work week in 2015, the response to that was so big that it just consumed all of my time. And I stopped taking instructional coaching contracts for a while, and I ended up having to quit Brain Pop too. I just didn't feel like I could keep up with everything there, which was so sad. I did not want to do it, but like, I had to focus my time and energy on what was going to help me make the biggest impact in the world. So, 2015 was when I really started focusing on 40-hour. That's when I started this podcast and really started focusing on what can I do to support teachers online, which is what I had been doing sort of, in the background this whole time. But then it became really a focus of like, I think this is where my gifts and talents are best used. I think this is where I can make the biggest difference, because when I was working with teachers, like, time pressures and overwhelm were just constantly the problem. Like, they wanted to do things, but they just didn't have time. They didn't have the mental bandwidth for it. And I wanted to create a solution to help with that. So that's where 40-hour came from. Basically, everything just sort of happened organically. And, like, one thing led to another. I published one book. I got an idea for another book. Then I got the idea for 40-hour, and I was like, this can't be a book, because it's a lot of resources that like don't fit a book's format. You need to have templates and videos and other things like that. So this needs to be a course. And, as new technology was developed, I just started doing new things. Podcasting was not an option 10 years ago, at least not that I was aware of. Now it is. So I just feel like as new ways of connecting with people and sharing ideas are developed, I just sort of go along with them. So I guess in the present and the future episodes that I'm doing in this 3-part podcast series, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that. But, in terms of the past and getting where I'm at right now, I never really envisioned this. I didn't have like a 5-year plan. I just tried to stay in my own lane, doing the things that I loved and making a difference in the way that I felt like I could best make a difference and that were most enjoyable for me and that felt like good creative pursuit. And then just seeing what opportunities open up, what other new things come down the road and following them. And, if I'm going to tie this back to the stuff that I was saying about my childhood and my teenage years, like today, I feel so much more grounded in who I am, what's important to me, how do I want to be spending my time. And I'll talk about that in the next episode, like where I've landed on all of this. I may not have the perspective of a current classroom teacher. And I feel like sometimes there's pushback against people who aren't in the classroom, creating teaching resources or, quote, telling teachers how to teach. I hope that this episode gives you a little bit of perspective on what I think I bring to the table, why I'm here, and what my perspective is. I am a person who has lived and breathed education since childhood, since the last century, right? Like, I've been in this game a really, really long time, and I've been collaborating with teachers all over the globe for more than 2 decades. What I have is a person who's seen a lot of different things, experienced a lot of different things, and questioned it all. Been questioning since a child. Why are things the way they are? What do we want to keep? What do we need to let go of? Is there a better way than the way things have always been done? What can we do different? What's next? And having that experience of knowing what it's like to be in the classroom, to be an instructional coach, having seen so many different classrooms all over the country, I feel like that's the aspect of my work that I'm most proud of. And the fact that I'm still here. So no, I don't know what it's like to be currently in the classroom. And that's a really important viewpoint. That's why almost every single guest I have on the podcast is a current classroom teacher. That's why the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Summit is featuring all current classroom teachers. That piece is really important too. But I'm still immersed in education. And what I'm attempting to do with my resources and with this podcast in particular is continuing to learn in public, to learn and grow with you, to take you along on my journey as I change as a person, as an educator, as I learn new things. You're learning right alongside of me. And I'm just trying to share that process. So, there's no way to be an expert on everything in education. And certainly I can't be an expert in pandemic era teaching or post-pandemic era teaching. But I hope that my lived experiences throughout my life have helped shape the resources that I create in a way that is useful. I hope that all of the research and time and energy that I have put into my own personal and professional development, into mindset work, into coaching, into productivity research, all of the trainings and observations and things that I have done over the last few decades are bringing value to you and adding to your perspective, whatever your role in education might be. So in the next episode for this series, I will share more about where I'm at today, what I believe, how I'm living, what I'm working on, what I'm passionate about. And then I'll do one more episode that talks about the future, not only what I see for myself and have planned for myself, but what I think about for the future of education. So if you listen to this whole thing, thank you. Thank you for that. I am so grateful to you for following me on my journey, for allowing me to be vulnerable with you. As I shared in the beginning, this is not something that comes naturally to me. I'm always really hesitant to do it because people could just be very judgy online and they think they know you when all they see is what you post online. It's tough. It's really tough. But 20 years is a monumental accomplishment. And I don't want to just let that pass by. I want to recognize it. I want to celebrate it. I want to reflect, and I want to share that reflection with you. So thanks for letting me do that.